Now we are gonna start the questions.
It's a really critical issue, and it has a lot of political and social implication. Talking about inflation and being on the fence when it comes to price liberalization, based on your paper, I understand that we have been on the fence for 60 years between keeping the administrative prices or full liberalization of such prices. Sometimes we fast track, sometimes we pull the brakes. There is no clear framework. But my question here to you is, so the informal sector in Egypt is of significant size. Did you take it into account as a variable or a dummy in your model? Because should I take it into my account, the figures might change. I totally agree with Dr. Hani that the commodity basket is not good, particularly telecom. Uh, Everyone is holding a mobile phone basically. So this, how come this happened, and how this basket should capture that. Lastly, we need a second wave of reform that include legislative as well as institutional, not only monetary and physical reforms. It is a whole picture that should be completed with institutional reform, with anti-corruption measures, and rather than this lack of physical rules, we can expand the taxation base and we can expand this base. The whole taxation system should be revisited for larger revenues rather than resorting to the debts and to the loan. Thank you so much. Our job and our duty here in life is to introduce these institutional reforms. Dr. Dia is renowned for his exceptional work. I have one comment that linked to the paper. I think it's time for a macro-funded research. When you put your slide of the bubbles, you can see the consistency between the vegetables and fruits that drive the inflation. And the variables you included are valid, but we already know beforehand, before your paper. Um, But there are some sectoral specific issues that have to do with the competition within each sector, the transportation and logistical, the structure of the market, the agreements between the farmers and the producers. All of these factors create this persistent increasing prices, and that's why they do not budge. I believe it's going to be very beneficial to have macro-funded research on inflation. And two comments regarding the CBE. It's good now that we are debating increasing the interest rate or not. Secondly, CBE stating that it is not inflation, it is not doing any inflation targeting, but is going to do that in the future. And you said that we needed the different infrastructure for that. Yes, the CBE stated that it is 13%, but there is another headline inflation that is 9% minus or plus 3% in 2020. The macro-funded research is our next project, and we are already in the talks. So you are welcome to join us. Thank you, Doctor, for your presentation. It was excellent. I have a question and two comments. The first question has to do with the relation between the budget deficit and the fiscal spending with the GDP growth. Some decisions might be taken for budget spending because it's going to get you some benefits down the line. But what I mean, should we do that? Can we have a long-term growth? My comments have to do with the inflation and increasing the interest rate. I do not believe that the CBE increased the interest rate in order to fight or to combat inflation. It did that in order to collect the hard currency at a time while the reserve rates were in the minus. So the stated purpose is completely different from the actual one. I totally second the opinion that the overnight drop of the 50 piasters, the dollar exchange rate, although I am not surprised to see this temporary drop because there was an over devaluation in 2018. In my estimation, we should not have moved from the actual or the official 8 and with a black market rate of 11 and to jump to 18 EGP to $1. I retract my comment. I thought that the parallel market used to sell the dollar at 11 or 12. However, it jumped from 13 to 20 in 3 or 4 months. Thank you. Good morning. I noticed that no one introduced themselves, so let me be the first one. I'm Dr. Ma Mustafa. I'm really pleased because Dr. Abla is my professor, and we have Dr. Farkhanda Hassan in attendance, and she is also my professor. This is on a very personal note. I'm here. This is one of the best seminars I ever attended. It's a very critical point, and I can see the different arguments. The demand-driven or the cost push. Dr. Omar mentioned it first. Before the devaluation, it was said that the interest rate would come up since the inflation is demand-driven, but it jumped higher than the projection that they already put, and then they increased the interest rate after it did not match the first forecast. When this supply shock happened in the West, the CBE also introduced the cost supply policy solutions, and they looked for other energy substitutes and created a more business-friendly environment. While we did not done this policy here in Egypt, we have a problem with the productivity. We have 10% GDP. What Dr. Abla mentioned, or everyone mentioned, that the institutional institutional reform is key, but it's not going to be very valid without any political reform. Two more points. In monetary school, we learn that in order to increase money supply growth rate, it must be parallel with the GDP growth rate. So that was not mentioned, and I believe that this does not happen. Secondly, the country must tackle the population problem, and this is the huge umbrella. It cuts across every other issue, including inflation, and also the point that everyone talked about, the FDI and the SMEs and the business environment. This is the bottom line, and this is the salvation, productivity and production. Thank you, Dior, Nadine. It was a very rich presentation, as usual. I agree with many of the points that were raised already when it comes to the what's behind monetary growth. Even if we can conjure from Martin Friedman. You correctly mentioned that the increase in the public debt, and part of this data has not been audited correctly because the increase in this public debt is not really aligned with the budget deficit, meaning that there are other motives. Pertaining the the macroeconomic policy mix, capital openness with a de facto exchange rate that is stabilized. Officially, it is liberalized, but de facto there is some relative stability. This invokes the question: is there really is the CBE able monetary autonomy? Does the CBE have really monetary autonomy so that it can cover the interest parities, because it does have implications on inflation? They will have to sterilize, which leads to driving up the inflation rates and is going to attract more capital inflows. That was my point on monetary autonomy. Thank you, Dr. Dio, and thanks to all the panelists. My question pertains to fiscal rules, because I like your comment that this is a trend that has become almost the rule. People or countries put the rules to follow them. My concern here, and I would like to understand your perspective, just as much as we were talking about inflation targeting, Egypt did not announce that. Rather, it gave some indication that it is in the process of moving towards inflation targeting. The simple reason is the precondition. There are some preconditions for the inflation targeting that are not yet fulfilled, and should we announce that without taking the preconditions, is going to be even worse. So in parallel, for the fiscal rules, I believe that there are some preconditions in order to establish these fiscal rules. The example that you gave, in very simple terms, should we put the 5% precondition for the fiscal the budget deficit. What are the measures? I mean, talking about fiscal, if we're talking about fiscal rules, we're not talking about the composition of public expenditure. We skip this part. So the revenue side of the budget, bearing in mind that all the figures that we are looking at are the budget sector. We have the general government, which includes the whole universe of economic authority and SOEs, which carry fiscal risks even while improving the indicators. So I would like to listen to your perspective. Thanks for your very valuable comments. I'm going to start with a comment made by Dr. Ola about the informal sector. Unfortunately, I do not have the ability to capture how the informal sector is developing from 2000 to 2018. What I could do was to put the variable in a very crude, we calculated in a very crude manner. There are issues with the GDP figures because there is part of the demand that is not captured. When I put this variable, it appeared insignificant, but the other determinants explain 98%. So I did not believe that adding this variable would have made a difference. As for the reforms, I hope that this would be the first wave of reform to the institutional and the structural reforms. I agree that macro-funded research on inflation is key. I found that in 1 year there was no shocks and the food price in Egypt reached 20 or 30% completely unjustifiably. So there is a problem with the value chains, particularly in the food production sector. And there is some disparity between the production and what is available on the market. All of this should be captured. I totally agree. I hope that one day we'll be able to reach this point. The value chains and the monetary policies are key. We have the targets for the monetary policy, but I wanted to have clearer communication on the part of the central bank, because if I have a floating exchange rate regime that is tied to the to some requirements, then I should go for the inflation targeting. But rather, we stood in the middle. We did not take a decision. This confusion is already inflicting everyone, and the only one and the only authority that can answer is the CBE, Central Bank of Egypt. Mr. Hussein asked about the fiscal policy and GDP growth. After 2010, we had a 1% growth rate. There was fiscal spending drive that was really high. The public or the government agencies ballooned from 5 million to 7.5 millions. The question is, do we need this inflation, inflationary growth? The fiscal, we like this fiscal drive, and in order to reach this 10% growth rate in 2030. Apart from inflation, I'm going to tell you why it is impossible to happen. Very simply put, we have the gap between the saving and investment ratio. In order to be able to reach this point, we need 30% investment. If the savings go higher, and this gap could be 10%, that we have a 10% of the GDP, which translates into $30 billion. Could it be addressed? So I'm telling you that this is impossible with in the light of these saving rates. So we have fiscal discipline. Some of these savings are wasted because we have high deficit. And these high inflation rates actually encourage consumption over saving. So it helped us, but we are still persistent on reaching a very unrealistic objective, and it's going to lead to really higher inflation rates. So I believe that the intentions are good, but the manner, the way that has been adopted, the policies has been adopted, is not the best one. This is linked to the question: do I want to have a market economy or a driven one? When we had the low energy prices in Egypt, many cement and steel factories opened. Now they are suffering. Then I'm not helping in the right manner. The two points that have to do with the physical rules, the exchange rate management. We created a policy paper in 2017, and I believe that there was an overshooting. Yes, based on our data, this is correct. The dollar at the point of the liberalization, it should have been 13. But in our paper, we created projections from 2017 to 2020. According to our projections, 2019 it should have reached 19, and by the next year it should have reached 20 by the year 2020. Should these figures come across as wrong? Is it the best interest of the CBE to have a stronger currency or a lower one? If we strengthen the currency, the prices are not going to go down, but if it's lower than its actual value, then it's going to help the export. And this is what the Eastern Asian country did over the decades. So the exchange rate issue still is a black box to be investigated. Dr. Ma, the cost push inflation and demand pull inflation, I have to understand the proxies. So I'm asking myself, we are taking pride in a 5% growth or GDP growth. Do we have the ability to reach this point with fiscal spending? The last year's growth, based on the Ministry of Planning, the 5.5 growth came from the real estate sector. This is not a productive one. This is not going to help the economy. Population growth, the population growth issue is linked to demand, particularly when it comes to the food prices. The agriculture production, we need to understand, is going to go higher or not. We said that the agricultural land is decreasing, but but the figures are going higher. So the two digits do not align. So the social reform and the political reform linkages, I'm going to leave this question to Amr to answer.
Dr. Sarah, but please let me highlight this. I was honored to comment on a paper written by Dr. Sarah Nashar 2 months ago, and this paper was about accounting analysis for the public debt from 60% to 100% as a percent of the GDP. There are 8.5 5 percentage that's not accounted for, and the analysis is there because in order for the public debt to increase, the public deficit should have increased, and that's the sequence. The sequence should go like that, but she took all that into consideration, and the residual was 8.5 from the national product. This is very weird. As to the central bank, I don't know what to say. But this impossible trinity, which has been just going on and on, I don't know, maybe the central bank thinks that the Minister of Economy is not on the right track. I don't know. This is very perplexing for me. But even though, are they going to be committed to the fiscal rules if there are fiscal rules? The question is, do the decision makers have or believe in the decision making? There's only one person here, and I know they don't want to listen. They don't want to see or to listen to another narrative. I think that the route we're going on, inflation, taxation, is the only way. That's what they think. But no, there are alternatives, but it's falling on deaf ears, like saying, I mean, I think that I've answered all the things, but all this is related to the independence of the central bank. You keep attacking the central bank, but the independence is the only way out. Institutional reform, of course, this is the most important objective, and the political will. If there is no political will, no reforms, and nothing else takes place. So the bottom line is the institutional reform. It's no joke. That's the only and exclusive reform. As to the population, yes, we do have a problem or problems concerning population, and it's going on, and we are going to write something about the macro-funded level of inflation, and the fiscal discipline is a key to this. But I think that fiscal discipline, I put it under the umbrella of institutional reform. Now, the most important thing is that Milton Friesen really is worth awarded the Nobel Prize, and he is a laureate, a real laureate. So I thank you, all of you, for well listening. Thanks a lot for well listening.